Allan Kessing never wanted to speak out about anything until he wrote a report damning the security at Sydney Airport. When the report was leaked, the damage went all the way to the top.
Allan Kessing, bag packed, ready to go to jail for leaking a confidential report about slack security at Sydney Airport.
Hi Allan, I'd like you to explain what your job was, say 2002 at the Sydney Airport.
In 2002 I was asked specifically to prepare a report on security failings and security problems and criminal activity at the airport. I was given this task by my senior officer, and basically I had to review all the documentation and evidence they'd gathered in previous years and see if there was any patterns or so on. So I basically did an analyst's job on old information. When I advised my senior officer that there was continuing involvement, it was suggested that I prepare formal reports, first of all on one specific area of activity, and then when that was rejected, that took about 3 months to do the original one in 2002, and when that was rejected by senior management, my senior officer, my direct officer, asked me to prepare a more general one in which I took a cross-section of all holders of the so-called ASIC, that is the security ID cards that allow the holders to enter behind the public areas, the so-called sterile areas of the airport, such as aircraft refuelling, maintenance, provisioning, cleaning, baggage handling, duty-free areas, everywhere that the public never sees.
Found guilty of whistleblowing, Kessing was convicted under the notorious Commonwealth Crimes Act. Drafted in the overwrought era at the start of World War I to prevent the release of secret information, the Crimes Act still operates in the same way today.
And you were charged under Section 70 of the Crimes Act.
Well, it was the Section 70 was introduced into the Crimes Act in 1904 because we were worried about a Russian invasion, and the Labor Party, when it was in opposition, were very much in support, fair weather support during opposition, but when they came to government, their sudden belief in the values of freedom of information and free speech and whistleblower protection seemed to become somewhat subdued. They did appoint a Mark Dreyfus, who before he joined Parliament was a very strong advocate of human rights and freedom of information. He was a lawyer, so they appointed him to look into reform of the whistleblowing laws, and especially the removal of Section 70 from the Crimes Act. 18 months later he came up with a report which advocated exactly that the Section 70 should be repealed, that whistleblowers should be given protection, and that was it took him 18 months to come up to with that conclusion, and 18 months later haven't heard a dicky bird.
With the reports that you actually gave to your superiors, how did they ever act on it? Or?
No, they were rejected out immediately upon presentation, and there was never any question about why, because we were warned by the same senior management that what we were proposing by pointing out all the failings, that it was going to cost the airlines and, more to the point, the privatised airport corporation big bucks to rectify. Now, the point about it is that the rectifications would merely have brought them in line with the requirements of the Customs Act, but nonetheless they were rejected purely for commercial reasons, and we were told that straight out. Well, before we handed them in fact, they were trying to put us off completing the reports in the manner that the need dictated, or to, when they were presented, just no, well, as we've said, this is going to impose too great a cost, and they won't be implemented. Thank you very much for your work. Now go back to general duties.
And how did you feel about that?
Can't say I was surprised, because we've been forewarned, and it is the nature of any organisation, doesn't matter whether it's customs or police or even a large commercial organisation. No organisation really wants to have its failings pointed out, because by definition that means that senior management aren't doing their job.
Kind of contradicts the reason as to why they want you to put it together then, wouldn't it?
But it wasn't senior management that wanted me, it was only my immediate officer, immediate senior officer. And basically the reason for that is because senior management had made it clear some months previously, before I joined the covert unit, that they were determined to close that particular unit. And one of the reasons I was asked to prepare these reports was to show that the unit needed to continue to exist. In the event it was unsuccessful, because when I went away on long service leave in 2004, the unit was disbanded and the officers returned to general duties. In fact, 2 officers resigned because of that, and the Customs Service lost many years of absolutely vital expertise and experience in those 2 officers who resigned. When I first heard of my reports being leaked 2.5 years after I wrote them, my first thought was, I think that was 31st of May, and unfortunately Schapelle would have been convicted on the 27th of May of 2005. My first thought was, somebody obviously had this story. Why didn't they publish the story whilst the trial was still going on? And then my second thought was, what a shame that my reports were suppressed when they were written back in 2003, because if the recommendations that I made in those reports had been implemented, the whole Schapelle Corby tragedy would not or should not have occurred, because the illicit activity and the shoddy procedures would have been cleaned up.
Yeah, the gaps in the security failings would have been plugged.
One would have hoped, yeah, if my recommendations had been taken up, yes. And 2 years afterwards, it took the tragedy of Schapelle for somebody to publish a story, and yet you then have to wonder, well, why was it published 4 days after her conviction? Why wasn't it published even a week or 2 before? Surely that would have made a difference.
Give me any idea of the level of insecurity and corruption at the airport in the period of maybe when Schapelle Corby flew?
It's always been from the very bottom, from the cleaners, the guys who push around mops and buckets, right up to the top, whether it's the commercial side such as the airline staff themselves, or even some customs officers, or quarantine for that matter. There have been many cases over the years when sworn officers have been found to have been corrupt and committing criminal offences. So you could not say that one group does or does not do something. It's just spread throughout every layer of activity at the airport. So
there were like groups of workers, say from the cleaners to the...
Well, sometimes there were groups, sometimes they were just individuals. But the point is there was always a risk, there was always a vulnerability to both criminal activity, even in minor forms such as stealing duty-free, right through to stealing from passengers' bags. And the mere fact that there is criminal activity means that there is a possibility of terrorist activity.
Well, Mr. Jeff Dixon actually confirms that point in a statement that he made to the Sydney Morning Herald regarding Allan Conwell, the airline security manager. Qantas Chief of Staff Jeff Dixon today said airline security manager Allan Kessing was sacked on May 20th because he knew people being investigated over alleged drug smuggling. That's unacceptable in any position, particularly security, he said. A Qantas baggage handler was dismissed last month and investigations into a drug smuggling ring. Mr. Dixon said other employees could have been involved. If you actually look at that, I mean, you've got a cross-section of staff that work both airports.
And everybody who's been quoted there, and that was over a period of only a couple of weeks when it was absolutely vital. This was while the Schapelle Corby trial was going on. It's absolutely vital that more emphasis was put on this during the trial rather than after the event. But that was actually whilst the trial was going on. They are acknowledging that these illicit activities are taking place, but for some reason they refuse, or the government refused to take what little knowledge they did have and make proper representations.
And that brings me to actually the CCTV footage, which was said to have actually disappeared. I've been doing some investigating myself to find out that, yes, they have upgraded the CCTV footage now at Qantas Airport, but that's actually in the check-in, you know, when you actually go into the airport. What I'm wondering still is, where are the cameras that actually check on what the baggage handlers are doing, like on the behind the scene?
If you're referring to the domestic, we can't know that because my expertise was entirely the international, but I would suspect that they do have some. But the point is they didn't at the time, because I think, as Dixon said, we were not required by regulation to have cameras in the baggage handling area of the domestic. Little coverage there was by CCTV was clearly inadequate at the time, and it's taken 4, 5, 6 years to bring it up to supposedly 100% coverage now. And I can only hope and pray that the same tragedy does not occur again. Another innocent passenger being used as an unwitting courier by corrupt personnel behind the scenes, and once again they forget to take it out, or for some reason they don't take it out, and that passenger goes on to a high-risk destination.
So we shouldn't actually think of Sydney Airport as just a single cell.
No, there's any number of groups. As I said, everything from the cleaners upwards. Probably the most vulnerable is the people who go on aircrafts after the passengers leave. Now, just I think in the last few months, in fact earlier in 2011, there was a newspaper report of a classic example which was as well known to customs officers of drugs being left on the plane and left on the plane by a passenger who then went off perfectly innocently through the passport control and out into the public, but the drugs were left on the plane and picked up by the staff who come on to clean the plane. Now that one's been around so long it's got whiskers on it, yet it's still going on, which shows that there's been very little done to counteract it. It would be quite easy to counteract. It would simply be that all cleaners are scrutinised when they leave the plane. That's not done because it slows down things. And you must remember that airports are basically large shopping centres with runways attached. The sole purpose of the airport, especially privatised airports, is not the movement of passengers, it is the spending of money by those passengers and the people who are waiting for them or seeing them off. And if you delay the traffic, if you delay the passengers getting on and off planes, then that cuts down profits, and that cannot be...
So you're infringing on their profit margins.
You're curtailing profits, and given that the airports, Sydney Airport is now privatised, the majority owned Macquarie Bank, that was something that cannot be tolerated, and up with which they will not put, as Churchill said of another matter.
And how serious was it?
Well, it was endemic. It had been going on for a long time, and I have no doubt that it's still going on. It is serious in that it shows that the that most, all airports with which I'm familiar, are extremely vulnerable, and as far as I'm aware from what colleagues tell me, that has not changed significantly, despite the so-called $200 million promised by the Howard government to rectify it following the Wheeler report, which looked into my reports and confirmed the vulnerabilities, made recommendations. The Howard government promised to spend $200 million rectifying this, and from what my colleagues tell me who are still in the service, there's been virtually no change. The vulnerabilities still exist, and obviously drugs are still coming in. Otherwise, every law enforcement agency throughout the world, in the Western world, says at the best they intercept no more than about 10% of drugs, and that's demonstrated by the fact that drug prices have remained stable or have actually fallen in most Western countries, and Australia is no exception.
It was reported in the Sydney Morning Herald on the 8th of May 2005, Ray Cooper, former head of operations for the AFP Internal Investigations, told Channel 9 Network it was well known by the AFP that unwitting passengers were being used as drug mules to shift drugs from Australian domestic airports. He said that his investigations suggested some states and some federal police were in league with the smugglers. Quote, "It is well known amongst the federal police that this particular operation and strategy was being adopted by criminals," Mr. Ray Cooper said.
Well, I couldn't disagree with that. And as he makes clear, it is well known that this is going on, and yet we have, people trying to deny it. Now, Cooper is a fairly well qualified person to be making these comments, and he wouldn't make those comments lightly. And it is well known. They use it. The corrupted personnel behind the lines in the baggage handling or wherever are using the domestic airports to smuggle drugs between the state capitals, for instance. That, yes, I'm glad to see he's confirmed it.
Yeah. Mr. Cooper also said some Australian airports suffered from a lack of security that made it easy for drug smugglers to gain access to passenger baggage. Speaking about the Gold Coast airport, Mr. Cooper said, "There is no control at the back of the airport. Every man and his dog has access to the baggage." It
simply confirms what we know and suspect, but the fact that it's such a high-profile person as Ray Cooper would confirm it, and he's going out on a limb to say that, exposing himself to all sorts of snide innuendo, and he is basically showing Mick Keelty's statements to be untrue. When I came back on duty in 2005, and when Schapelle Corby was on trial, it was a matter of constant discussion amongst customs officers, because most customs officers knew that there were dodgy procedures going on, and our particular group knew better than anybody just how dodgy they were. And those officers who hadn't already resigned were absolutely consumed with anger. There's no other word for it, sheer fury, that reports that we had submitted to point out exactly these vulnerabilities had now resulted in this, which we've warned against over and over and over. In other quotes in the media, he is saying there is no knowledge, there is no evidence, he's always trying to point to the fact of ignorance, and in law, ignorance is no defence. So if he and his staff were ignorant, which I don't believe, then they are culpably incompetent. So what more can you say? It's just a disgrace from beginning to end, the fact that this information was well known to customs officers and AFP for years, as is demonstrated by the occasional busts reported in the media in the late part of 2004 and the early part of 2005. showing imports of drugs using corrupt handlers or corrupt staff at the airport, and yet you can make a statement like that when somebody's life was in the balance over in Bali. It's just outrageous. If the Australian authorities had acknowledged to the Balinese court that there was significant doubt about the case, if they had simply admitted that the airport was full of holes, that baggage handlers were notoriously corrupt, as had been shown time and again in the previous months and even the previous year of drug importations using corrupt handlers, it must have cast massive doubt on any absurd notion that she was guilty. It could not have possibly have sustained a conviction with this knowledge. But the really awful thing about it is that if my reports had been acted upon when they were written 2 years previously, this situation should never have arisen, because the holes in the system would or should have been fixed. But the mere fact that these reports were suppressed for the worst of reasons, the cost to commercial entities, and somebody is paying for it basically with their life and their sanity now, is an absolute outrage.
Officials, detectives of the force, they knew earlier on why the girl was going to court about a corrupt drug smuggling ring with an airport. And on the same day she flew overseas. But the so-called honorable man, they let the evidence blow in a breeze.
All comes back to the well-known quote from Edmund Burke, from a 19th century philosopher and founder of modern conservative thought. He said, "For evil to succeed, it is only necessary that the good do nothing." And that's what's happened here. When the facts were known, the good did nothing or too little, and evil succeeded.